the thing.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the 2021 Stand Up to Racism Conference. First of all, I'd like to pass on our condolences to the loved ones of Sir David Amess MP, who was brutally killed on Friday in his Southend West constituency. So our thoughts are with his friends and families. We've got lots of MPs here who can talk about the threats and abuse they face on a daily basis. We also have a wonderful range of trade union general secretaries, faith community representatives, and fantastic anti-racists. And this session, How Do We Defeat Johnson's Racist Offensive, comes at a timely moment. Just this week, the latest hate crime statistics were released, which show a 9% increase in hate crimes, of which a staggering 70% were racist attacks. So it just goes to show how important campaigning against racism is. Since Friday, we've also seen a rise in the use of Islamophobic language. So we've got to be mindful of campaigning against Islamophobia. There are also some positives. In the last year, we've seen fantastic leadership from footballers taking the knee, which is wonderful in communicating an anti-racist message to a mass audience, and the majority of the public support them in doing that, which is very good news. So we've got a great panel. There's lots to talk about. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to my other co-chair this evening. And I'm Sabi Dalu, by the way. I forgot to introduce myself, and I'm co-convener of Stand Up to Racism. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sabi. So I'm Nimi Trivedi, and I'm co-chairing, as Sabi said, with her. So I'd like to also welcome everybody to this plenary. I am a campaigner, anti-racist campaigner, part of Stand Up to Racism Wales. So our first speaker is going to be Dawn Butler, who's going to kick off the plenary this evening. Dawn is an MP for Brent South, and an inspiring figure, both in Parliament and outside, in challenging government racism, lies and damaging legislation. So welcome, Dawn.
Thank you very much, Nimi, and thank you, Sabi, as well. And big thanks to Stand Up to Racism and the continual fight that you all do, because it is important that we never take our foot off the pedal, because as soon as we do that, things start rolling backwards. And can I also say what a pleasure it is to be on such a panel where we have sort of Gary, Younge, Jermain, Margaret, Tan, Bell, Mick Whelan from ASLEF. You've got a fantastic panel to end your day of campaigning for this conference. I want to kind of put a couple of things into perspective in regards to how racism manifests itself. Some people think that we're always going to see a video and that video is going to go viral and that is racism. It starts way before then. It starts from school, when children are excluded from school. It starts with police brutality. It starts with politicians and their policies, and how they act and how they other people, how they try and dehumanize people, not immigrants, people. And that's where it starts. So when people sometimes say, you know, that George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd was a turning point for the debate on racism, I say it wasn't a turning point, it was just another brutal act that reinforces the point that things have to change. And it means that we all have to be anti-racist all the time, but it is a concerted effort that needs to happen. It means that we do have to stand up and call out this government and their authoritarian laws. The reason why this government is producing the legislation that they're producing is that they are deliberately appealing to a certain group of people. and it manifests itself in really dark ways. And you mentioned, Sabi, the brutal killing, which we can't really talk about, of Sir David. It is really sad and depressing when you think that we're in a job where we're supposed to make our country a better place, and sometimes we contribute to the rise in hate crime. And I think that it has to be a really deep reflection that we have to have in Parliament. And I think that we have to acknowledge that no matter how many times in regards to racism the government says it doesn't exist, we know it does exist. And we cannot allow ourselves to be gaslit in that way. Systemic racism and institutional racism exists in society, and one act of eradicating or removing one person will not change the system. So we have to look really a lot deeper at what needs to change in society. This war on woke is a deliberate strategy by this government, which makes no sense. Because if you're trying to say to people that you should not be awake to the injustices that happen in society, then what sort of society are you hoping to create? And so we have to be so mindful of what's happening, but we also have to be honest with ourselves and call it what it is. Because if we don't call it what it is, we can't stop it and we can't campaign against it. And that's why Stand Up to Racism has such an important role to play. And I'm really happy to be here as part of that. And I want to end on just this, that the color of a person's skin, economic background, social and structural racial barriers and infrastructures are all factors to whether you have a good chance of surviving, whether it's surviving the education system, whether it's surviving the pandemic. And that should tell us something about racism. And I talk about equity quite a bit. You know, I want to see equity. And Nahid Desani said that equality is giving everyone a shoe and equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits. I want to see a society where we give people a shoe that fits. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Dawn, for that really powerful contribution, as always. I'd now like to introduce a video of Anna Sarwar, who is member of the Scottish Parliament and leader of the Scottish Labour Party. He is a consistent opponent of racism and the far right. He has provided a powerful critique of the government's Commission for Race and Ethnic Disparities report and the report into Tory Islamophobia, and been a key figure in building unity against the far right in Scotland.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to the Stand Up to Racism conference, and thank you for all you are doing to try and defeat prejudice and hate in communities across the country. Let's look at what's happening right here in Scotland, across the UK, and indeed across the world. Right across the world, we see the rise of nationalism, and that's a deliberate us versus them politics. We see it here at home, we see it in mainland Europe, we see it in other parts of the world, where deliberately politicians want power by dividing communities so they can hoard that both political power and economic power for their own ends, and who misses out and who loses out. And the real fear that I have is that my children are going to grow up in a more hate-filled, a more divided world than the one that I grew up in. And that is really, really scary. And that's why this conference and this campaign is so important. Undoubtedly, homophobia, racism, misogyny, and Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are on the rise across our society. So we have to redouble our efforts to confront that and challenge it. But how do we do it? We can't do it by picking and choosing our solidarity or our condemnation based on the politics of the perpetrator or the victim. We can't do it by having some kind of hierarchy or prejudice, and we can't do it by picking and choosing. Instead, we have got to build a movement of solidarity across our country, and that means supporting communities that may not be seen as our own. So don't leave the fight against Islamophobia to our Muslim communities. It has to be a fight for all of us. Don't leave the fight against anti-Semitism to our Jewish communities. It has to be a fight for all of us. Don't leave the fight against racism to our diverse BME communities. It has to be a fight for all of us. Don't leave the fight against homophobia to our LGBT communities. It has to be a fight for all of us. And don't leave the fight against sexism to our sisters and women across the country. It has to be a fight for all of us. because right across our country, prejudice and hate is having a negative impact on life experiences, life outcomes, and life chances. And let me give you one practical example of that. Right now, right across our country, women have to think twice when they're walking down certain streets, have to look over their shoulders or think about the charge on their phone. Right now, there are BME women, particularly those women that wear religious symbols, that are scared when they're standing on train platforms or underground platforms because of what might be said to them or done to them. Right now, there are people in workplaces who know they're not going to get that opportunity for a promotion or a job because of the colour of their skin, their background, or their accent. That can't be acceptable. And if we want to build that more equal society, if we want to change and defeat the politics of us versus them, we don't do it by creating our own version of an us versus them. We do it by creating an all of us, and all of us to take on that politics. So that means in all of us to defeat prejudice and hate. It means in all of us to bring our country together and defeat the politics of division. And it means in all of us to challenge inequality and prejudice in our society and defeat poverty in the process. That's why this campaign and that's why this conference is so important. Let's not fall into the despair and say another future is not possible. Let's not accept the premise that we have to live with the politics of Boris Johnson and the Tories till the end of time. We have got an opportunity to do something different. We have got an opportunity to build something better, but it requires us all to work together to make that a reality. So let's promise and pledge to redouble our efforts, not just to talk to those that already agree with us, but to persuade people who might not necessarily agree with us right now. Because by building that politics of empathy, of unity and hope, we can defeat this callous Tory government, we can defeat the politics of us versus them, and we can create a Britain that we want to bring up our children in and our grandchildren into.
Okay, well, apologies to everybody if you weren't able to hear that video, or there were any difficulties with visual, sort of visually seeing it as well. So real apologies. I mean, it was a very good video, and from the translation, you can see what was being said. So our next speaker is going to be Bell Ribeiro-Addy, MP. Welcome, Bell. Bell is the MP for Streatham and has been a driving force in leading parliamentary opposition to the government's racist offensive and linking up with the many areas of resistance to the hostile environment. So take it away, Bell.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I really want to start with echoing the words of Sabi and Dawn about Sir David Amess and his very tragic murder. It really does bring to light what those of us as members of Parliament fear on a daily basis, and how the threats and particularly abuse that we might receive, deeply impact us. And I think that it's a really, really difficult time. But in thinking about that, in thinking about what has happened and how the media have portrayed certain things, I'm really, really worried. So we heard firstly that the individual that is being accused is African looking, of Somali descent, and all of these things. And whilst I understand these are descriptions, it makes it very clear when people start to lean towards this type of language, the impact it can have on people, and the impact of how people from those communities are treated. Somebody has been killed, and that's not on everybody that may look like this particular assailant. And I think the media and government need to be really, really more mindful on the type of language they use, on the things that they say. They simply can't, put out all of these tropes to either sell headlines or to win elections, and then think they can put it back in the box. Those with that sort of power need to understand. And I think that didn't play out. That played out quite clearly when we saw what happened at the Euros. We saw what happened to the Euros, where weeks before the government, senior members of government were challenging England football players taking the knee, refusing to support them. And then when they were abused afterwards in that disgraceful way, having lost the game, then attempting to come back and say, oh, isn't it awful? But this is exactly the type of behaviour that's condoned when we're not responsible about our language, and we're not clearly standing up against racism in the way that we should. And it doesn't end there for the government and the media that continue to support them, because this government continues to be engaged in this really, really disturbing authoritarian agenda with all of the bills that we've seen going through. So from the right to vote, the right to protest, the right to take strike action, our democratic rights hard fought for by trade unions, and they're coming for all of them. And this is a major, major attack on us. And all that it is the government want to remove all of the modes of opposition that we have to challenging some of their most disgraceful policies. The policies that we're seeing are causing a serious downgrade in living standards. And they just want to continue to weaken our ability to stand up to that. And, that they're using various different methods to do this. And unfortunately, with the 80-seat majority that we have in Parliament, a lot of this passes not unchallenged, but quite easily. And it's so important that we have that support from the public and from people who may be protesting out on the streets, again, to actually make those gains and see some of these disgraceful policies out the door. Now, we're seeing at the moment, in particular, when it comes to policing, an increasing rise in racist policing, as far as I'm concerned, and looking at what's happened following the murder of my constituent Sarah Everard, a lot of misogyny within the police. And all of these things are not taken seriously. And it's hard, as somebody like myself who's meant to be protected by the police, who may face increased threats, to actually challenge the police, because you wonder, if you're a group of people that tends to challenge them, whether or not you'll continue to receive that support. And we are seeing all of these things play out now. The police are doing their own kind of review. The inquiry that is being launched is not even statutory. So we're not going to see the major changes that we need to see. And it's only the police would accept that they have institutional problems of racism and misogyny, perhaps we could begin to change these things. And if only our government, instead of author or requesting that disgraceful report in response to Black Lives Matter, the CRED report that literally said that there is no institutional racism, if we just accepted what the problem was, perhaps we can make some strides to change it. And the issue is, when people like myself do that, we're told that we're not patriotic. And I can't possibly understand how that's the case. When the suffragettes were campaigning for women's right to vote, perhaps they were called unpatriotic. But the idea that challenging something that's wrong in your country is unpatriotic is just ludicrous to me. What is more patriotic than wanting your country to be the best place possible for everybody to live, regardless of the color of their skin or any other characteristics that they might have? And I think it's so important to call out these really, really ridiculous ideas of what patriotism means, because they often pointed at people that look like me, because I couldn't possibly be patriotic because I don't look like apparently what somebody from this country is meant to look like. But I am British and I am proud of that, and will continue to campaign for everybody, regardless of what they look like in this country, to be treated fairly. And I just want to close, obviously, because a key part of that is education, and we couldn't let Black History Month pass during this session without mentioning it, and how key it would be to have Black history taught throughout our schools, and just to acknowledge Wales in taking that step forward and making that major difference. Because if racism is ignorance, then education is the absence of that ignorance, and educating young people coming up about what is the truth about our country and how we can make things better, I believe will play a massive part in challenging racism, and challenging racism in a way that all of us should. And just to say, it's so important that we're all here today. It's so important that we continue to campaign in the way that we do. And just to say, after leaving here, it's not about, I would say, saying that you've been on a march, saying that you've watched, this Zoom, or you've been to these various conferences, and feeling like that makes you an anti-racist. Even being Black doesn't make you an anti-racist. You may just not want people to be racist to you. What you need to do as an anti-racist is actively challenge it in every single form that you can. And only that way will we move forward to the type of society that we want to have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Belle, for that brilliant contribution. Also, all of you may know that Belle has been really fighting and campaigning against the government's Nationality and Borders Bill, which has also been dubbed the anti-refugee bill. And there are a couple of events coming up this week in relation to that. So there is a demonstration outside Parliament on Wednesday evening against that piece of legislation. And also on Saturday, next Saturday, the 23rd of October, there is a demonstration called by Amnesty International regarding that. So keep an eye out for those events and do attend if you can. I also want to read out a few messages of some of our viewers today. So we've got a message from Washington, DC, who say, solidarity to Dawn Butler MP. You were absolutely right to call out Boris Johnson's lies in Parliament. There's a message from Dennis, who says, the war on woke can't win. You can cut down all the flowers, but you can't stop the spring. So thank you very much for those messages. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, who has been a vociferous opponent of racism in Parliament. He's made some brilliant anti-racist speeches, including calling out Boris Johnson's attack on women wearing the niqab and Islamophobia. So I'd like to welcome Tan Singh, Dhesi MP.
Thank you very much, Sabi, and also to Nimi and Weyman for kindly inviting me. And I want to commend the great work of Stand Up to Racism in this collective endeavour. And may I also say it's a pleasure to be on such an esteemed panel with fellow parliamentarians, my good friends and colleagues, and also leaders within the union movement and other key influencers within our movement. I'd also like to extend my heartfelt condolences to the wife and family of Sir David Amess, who was so brutally taken away from all of us. And I think that it makes it all the more pertinent that we should be talking about extremism or racism and how it's portrayed and the huge impact that that can have on our society. Well, first of all, I want to discuss the government's own record on racism. And as Sabi mentioned, the likes of myself, we've been calling out not only certain members of the government, but the key person in the government, the Prime Minister. And Boris Johnson is someone who is synonymous with racist, sexist, and homophobic remarks. And many of us have been calling that out again and again. He cannot use language like letterboxes, bank robbers, pickaninnies with watermelon smiles and so on, and think that nothing's going to happen. We know that usage of such language has had a spike in hate crime, and it actually normalizes these sort of things within society. And that is why many other people end up using that, or they, as what happened with women, where they had those that were wearing hijabs or niqabs, they had tomatoes, eggs, etc. thrown on them. And that leads me on to another point, that look, along with calling that out, we need to show solidarity with others. So it's important that myself, as a Sikh, I'll stand up for others, whether that's Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, etc. But likewise, whether it's somebody of Asian or Indian heritage, that I stand up with others, whether they are of African, Caribbean, or other origins, and that goes deep in terms of when we're trying to deal with, for example, the Windrush scandal as well. And I would commend also the amazing work of the likes of, I know the likes of Diane and David and others aren't on the call, but thankfully we have got Dawn and Bell, but many other parliamentarians, they stood up and called out the government again and again on this Windrush scandal. So many other issues that have happened where the government has actually precipitated many of these false narratives. And also if we look at their legislation, whether that's the Nationality and Borders Bill, whether it's in terms of the police and crime sentencing bill, their constant need to be othering and their anti-migrant, anti-minority stance, and how that's fed in also through many of those in the right-wing media. I think that just shows the extent of what we are facing as a society, and why we need to make sure that we are doing our level best to stand up to that racism, but also to work towards a better, a more inclusive society. And let us not forget what has actually happened during this pandemic. Now, I know that people across our country, including many of us, we have lost our loved ones. But it's also notable that the impact of the pandemic has been especially especially hard hit in terms of those from Black and Asian minority communities, whether it's in terms of the level of deaths, whether it's in terms of even the doctors and nurses, that how there was a disproportionately large number of those. But the government at every single point has not agreed that that there is institutional racism within any of the structures, and that's I think to the detriment of trying to deal with the problem. And I think Bell and others have noted obviously the credit report, etc. Now I want to sum up with just saying that, one, please keep up the amazing work. Please do continue to express solidarity with others and calling out racism as and where we see it. I think it's very, very important that also that the trade union movement, they've shown a tremendous leadership on this, by the way. And I think that needs to carry on as well, because through those millions of members, they can make that huge impact within society. It's not just us within Parliament. I think through the funding of various programs that they're constantly doing, that is helping to change the narrative within our country. But thank you once again for inviting me, and I look forward to hearing other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tan, for your excellent contribution. And everything you raised really is all vital in terms of the points you said about, just about solidarity with everybody, but the impact of the pandemic and exposing the institutional racism which affects all our lives. And the next speaker I'd like to welcome, Tan was saying about the importance of trade unions as well and the vital role they play. So the next speaker I have the pleasure of inviting to speak is Louise Regan, who is a national officer for the NEU. The NEU has played a major role in supporting national anti-racist campaigns, mobilizing to defeat the far right and organizing teachers against racism in education and society. So welcome, Louise.
Hello, and thank you very much. And I come with apologies from Kevin Courtney, our Joint General Secretary, who unfortunately is ill and can't make it, and also from Daniel Gabedi, who is our National President, who also had hoped to be here. But I'm the National Officer for Membership and Equality, and it's a real privilege to be here. I attended a workshop earlier and had a really informative discussion with members that are here. I mean, I bring to you solidarity from the National Education Union. We are absolutely committed to supporting Stand Up to Racism, and this has been a really amazing day. And obviously, prior to the National Education Union coming into force, the National Union of Teachers was also absolutely committed to supporting the work that you are doing. As educators, I think we see on a daily basis the impact of racism in our communities, in our schools, in our workplaces, not only those things that face children and young people, such as the school exclusions, which were referred to earlier, where we know that Black children are 3 times more likely to be excluded than white children. But we also see the impact of police brutality and that racism within the broader society when it's brought back into our schools and colleges, and we have to work to fight against that. I have been committed to anti-racist education throughout my teaching career. I've taught for over 30 years. And as a union, we are completely committed to changing our system so that we are, one, decolonizing our education system, but also creating a very anti-racist core throughout the system. Somebody earlier talked about the Black History Month, and we should be delivering and talking about Black History Month in our schools, but actually that's not enough. We have to embed Black history throughout our curriculum, and we have to put it right at the core of what we are teaching our children and young people. They need to understand what has happened and the legacy of, the history of the country that they live in, but they also have to see themselves within the education system. And at the moment, I don't think that it is good enough. As a union, we've done a huge amount of work on this during the pandemic. We actually did a decolonising education conference before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, we've produced an anti-racist education charter. We're pushing that out amongst our members, and we are really calling upon our members to push that out in their schools and colleges. And actually, what we have seen is lots of young educators, particularly post, the murder of George Floyd, which, as people have said, is one incident amongst many, many, many incidents. But we have seen young educators realise that they have a place, a role to play in changing the education system. Our education system has been attacked by the governments over many years. We now have an opportunity to change that, and we are working really, really hard to do that. And I'll end with this, because I know we've got lots of speakers, but I think it's really important that we remember that no child is born racist. Okay, racism is something that is learnt, and therefore it's something that can be unlearnt. And as educators, we have a duty to make sure that our education system is challenging at every point racism where we see it, but is also educating our young people about a more equal, a more fair and a kinder society. And that is what we are committed to doing as a union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise, for that brilliant contribution. I think you're absolutely right. No child is born racist. It's something that is learnt, and it's something that can be unlearnt. So I'm going to read out a few more contributions from our viewers. So Adnan Chowdhury said, excellent talk, Belle, and thank you. And another person said, totally agree with Belle. The contribution of Black MPs like those on this call is Black history in the making. So, and we've got lots of people tuning in from all around the country: Eastbourne, Wales, Southampton, Harlow, Oxford, Aberystwyth, Birmingham. So we've got people from all around the country. And as I said earlier, someone sent in a message of support from Washington, DC. So that's brilliant. I'd also like to make another announcement. There is a very important event on Tuesday evening, Tuesday the 19th of October at 7 p.m. regarding institutional racism. It's a Justice for Ricky Real event. So Ricky Real was killed in 1997 and still no justice, which has been devastating and traumatic for Sukhdev Real, his mother, and the rest of the family. So I just wanted to announce that. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, who has been a fantastic campaigner against fascism for a very long time. And he's a huge supporter of Stand Up to Racism and the work we do. And his union, the RMT, is an affiliate of Stand Up to Racism and a big supporter of our work. I'd like to welcome the Assistant General Secretary of the RMT, Steve Hedley.
Thank you very much for the invite. And I think I'll start by briefly outlining what's happening in our particular industry. We're being massively attacked by this government and by the employers. And how that will affect the basically the racist setup of our workplaces is this. People who have been on the railway or in the bus industry for a long time and have pensions, terms and conditions are usually white, maybe some Afro-Caribbean. People who have come on lately have usually done so as contractors. If you look at London Underground, we've got the most of their cleaners are contractors. These are Black, Asian or East European, and mostly women. So the attacks that are going to come forward will be felt, the brunt of them will be felt, I think, amongst the grades, who especially in the ticket offices, the stations and the cleaning grades that are mostly of ethnic minorities, greatest proportion, and mostly women. And how did this situation arise? Well, basically, it is tantamount, really, the institutional racism in employment, because the kind of jobs that are being created now are low skill, low pay, London living wage jobs. And we as a union really haven't been doing enough to fight against that. So that's the kind of institutional racism that we're fighting every day when we take on the bosses. And this point mustn't be lost, because we are coming in for a crisis, I think, not just in the transport industry, but right across the piece, I think the perfect storm that we're going to have, where we're going to have really uneven development with the Brexit question. Drivers, for example, will be able to practically earn their own wages in the period to come, especially if you're driving lorries. But in other parts of the transport industry, we're going to have massive cuts because we've got around 2/3 of ridership that we usually have. And the bosses, by the way, who've been given £8 billion during this COVID period, have handed £1 billion to their shareholders. And this attack, they're going to be massive attacks on terms, conditions, wages, and indeed jobs. And I think we're going to have a situation where the far right will be exploiting that situation, and they'll be saying, well, you've lost your job, and that black person over there has still got a job, or that Asian person there has still got a job. The same situation, by the way, that they're already exploiting in this area where I live in Newham, in regards to housing, because with governments of whatever stripe, and they've all been equally guilty. The Conservative Party, the Labour Party, an absolute disgrace to a lot of them, haven't built any council houses around here in decades. And we have positions where people's sons and daughters and families have to move out to get council houses, and the far right play this thing up. And I think that's going to be equally the case now with employment. So how do we combat this? Well, I think first of all, what people should do is what my union done, was disaffiliate the Labour Party, save all that money that we're handing to Keir Starmer, who makes the right noises about racism, but doesn't actually deal with the fundamental causes of racism, which are inequality. And by the way, you always have racism as long as there's capitalism. And people who can come on here and deny that fact really are living in cloud cuckoo land. So if you're not tackling the inequality of the working class, there's absolutely no way that you're going to get rid of racism. And I think as a trade union movement, we've got to say that, we as a trade union, we give money to decent left-wing MPs, no matter whatever party they're in. We'll give money to candidates who we believe are socialists, who will be pushing the policies of the working class and anti-racist policies. What we won't be doing is giving money to the likes of Starmer and the same people who stood in pictures with Jeremy Corbyn now standing in pictures with Starmer because he happens to be the leader, and attacking and backing or failing to vote, abstaining on serious anti-working class policies, anti-trade union policies. I mean, why would we give money to them? And I see people around here from Unite and the bigger unions, and I think you need to look at your strategy as well. Why are you giving money to people who are attacking the working classes when we can give them to people who are going to defend us and decent campaigns like Stand Up to Racism? I think that's the way forward in the short term until we've actually got a party who's going to represent working class people. So I think the coming period is going to be very, very difficult. I think we're going to have a repetition of the 15,000 people, far right people who we saw on the streets with Tommy Robinson, or probably people who are more extreme than that, who are outright racists and don't deny the fact. And I think the scapegoating of minorities is going to be an absolute certainty. I think they're going to be trying to blame everybody except the government. And of course, the government ultimately would rather have them than us, because they're not going to challenge their wealth power and the redistribution of wealth. They're not going to challenge that, whereas people on the left, socialist people, will. So I think that the prognosis for a big growth in the far right is going to be absolutely on the cards. I think what we need to do as the left, especially in the trade union movement, is educate our people, educate them to the real attacks that are going on, the fact that the ruling class of this country are launching those attacks. When we talk about patriotism, I'm Irish, but I have no patriotism for a country. I have no patriotism for the ruling class. I've got patriotism towards the working class of our country. And I think that's a patriotism that we should be pushing, not that. Why would you be a British patriot with that disgraceful history of the British ruling class who enslaved the world, who conquered the world and plundered the world? Why would you be a patriot? The only patriotism, the only loyalty that we should have, the only allegiance that we should have should be the working class people, whether in this country, in Ireland or America and Russia or anywhere else. So that's sometimes difficult arguments they have in the workplace, but you can't pull a wool over people's eyes. Ultimately, if you want to build an alternative to the system that we're living in.
Thank
The
you,
only
Steve.
alternative is that we get rid of the capitalist system and we replace it with a system where we can have true equality of race, sex, sexuality, gender and everything else. So thanks for giving us the opportunity to speak, and we will continue our support for the anti-racist movement.
Thank you very much, Steve. And as you said, for all your support you continue to give to Stand Up to Racism and throughout the anti-racist movement, and that warning really that you've given about the far right is so important that we do continue to mobilise every time they try and mobilise themselves. So thank you very much, Steve. The next speaker I'd like to introduce is Jermain Jackman. Welcome, Jermain. Jermain is a singer and an activist. He won the BBC's The Voice in 2014 and has used his fame to promote anti-racism and progressive causes. So welcome, Jermain.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are joining us around the world. It's a pleasure to be speaking here and joined with so many amazing panelists. I want to give a massive shout out to Stand Up for Racism for putting on such an incredible and powerful event and bringing us all together. Sabi said it right. This conversation is happening at a very crucial time. And I'm going to be honest with everybody in the room that I'm worried. I'm really, really worried. Not only for the current state of affairs in this country, but the type of future that we are creating for future generations. Hate crime is up. Islamophobia is up. Racist online abuse is up. Misogyny is up. All under a man who panders to the far right, a man who himself has said racist, misogynistic, Islamophobic things, amongst others. Friends and comrades, the reality is this. This government is set on disenfranchising Black and other global majority communities here in this country by pushing through bills such as voter ID, a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. We know the impact it will have on marginalized communities around this country. We have a government who, frankly, doesn't care about the truth anymore. Doesn't care. They don't mind being dishonest. They don't mind lying. They don't mind their deceit because they know that the media is on their side. While millions worry about how they're going to put food on the table this Christmas, we have a government that's handing out billion-pound COVID contracts and eco deals to their mates. I am worried about the future we are creating for future generations. Young people are looking around for hope. Young people see this bumbling man at Prime Minister's questions or on the news and can't engage with what he's doing, can't engage with what he's saying. So we're going to hear a lot from speakers about what the message needs to be. And I don't want to go over that because many of us will speak about that. We've heard from some amazing speakers and we're going to hear from some more amazing speakers. But I want to talk about how do we communicate that message? How do we package the message in a way where people can really engage with it? It can resonate with people. Because we're all drinking the coffee. We're all in the same space where we all agree on what anti-racism is, on what our strategy needs to be, on how we need to come together, on how we need to get these Tories out. We can all agree on that. But how do we communicate it effectively? What platforms are we using to engage with young people? With people, are we using terms like hard to reach? Things like that don't exist. And this is what I really want to challenge and charge everybody who's not only in this Zoom conversation, but everyone who's watching at home, online, or around the world. What can we do to challenge it in our day-to-day lives? What can we do to challenge racism in our day-to-day lives? And how can we combine our strengths and our efforts? How can we unite with one another, with the organizations that we know of, support them, amplify their work, but also challenge it communicate it, build the movement. That's what we need. We need that hope moving forward. The next general election is not too far away, and people are talking about Boris bringing a snap general election much sooner. How do we ensure that we can set this country on a better path? We haven't even really held those responsible for the people who have died in Grenfell Tower. My heart breaks when I look at this country. And as a young adult, trying to forge out a career for myself, a life for myself, a life for my community and my family and my friends, it's difficult. We are looking to all of you right now. The general secretaries, the MPs, the politicians, the activists, the lawyers, the doctors, the leaders, the community activists, the grassroots organizations. Come together. Now is the time. Now is the time. I see that my time is up, but I want to end with this. The only way we can bring about change is if we come together. And I'm sick and tired of all of us arguing amongst one another. Because while we spend time arguing with one another, the young black boy will still get stopped and searched by an institutionally racist police force. The young black woman will still die while she's trying to give birth to her baby. While we argue, people are still facing and targeted by our racist country. Now is the time we come together, and now is the time we act. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jermain, for that brilliant contribution. I'd now like to read out some more comments from some of our viewers. So Kevin said, as an Irish Catholic, I'm so tired of being labelled a territory and told to go back to where I came from by right-wingers. Someone called Ian said, unions need to come out strongly against Boris Johnson's racist argument that migrants cause low wages. And then another person said, we've got to remember people like Blair Peach and Stephen Lawrence. So thank you to all our viewers, and keep those comments coming in. It's really good to hear your views. So I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, who is a fantastic human rights lawyer and chair of the Society of Black Lawyers. And he's been a staunch campaigner against racism for decades. I'm very pleased to welcome Peter Herbert. Peter, are you okay? Are you okay to mute yourself? Unmute. Or if we're having technical issues with Peter Herbert, I think I should just introduce our next speaker. Okay, so we'll come back to Peter Herbert. So I'll introduce our next speaker, who is, I'm very pleased to welcome here today with us, who is the General Secretary of Unite the Union and was recently elected in August. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome here today, Sharon Graham.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for the invite, and I'm really pleased to be here. And as you've mentioned, I'm recently elected as the General Secretary of Unite, and one of the platforms that I was elected on was this whole thing around a little less conversation, a little more action. And one of the things that I've said around all of the things that we're doing in Unite is that ultimately, we are now going to need to be the vanguard, the movement I'm talking about, not Unite on its own, are going to need to be the vanguard of many, many things. We know that workers are being lined up to pay for the COVID crisis. We know that our Black and Asian members and workers will be paying for it far more. There'll be a double whammy. And we also know that the government is not going to lift a finger to do anything for these workers or these communities. In 2008, we saw what happened after the financial crash. This will be like that on steroids unless we are able to deal with it and push back. So one of the things that I stood on and that I was brought in on was this position around the fact that we now must mobilise. There's no point us relying on somebody else. There's no point us saying it's somebody else's job to do, whether that be about justice campaigns or whether it be about what's happening in workplaces. We now need to mobilise across our communities and in our workplaces also. And I've been with our Black and Asian members last week and talking about the fact that actually we need to move to action, not words. And I just want to focus on the little time I've got on two things. First of all, how can we deal with racism through collective bargaining? How can we begin to make that mean something? And also how we can be a much bigger part of justice campaigns. It's fine for us to sponsor things. We will sponsor lots of things and we do sponsor lots of things. But actually, is that an abdication of our responsibility? Should we not be part of these campaigns? Should we not be leading these campaigns around what is happening to Black members and people and Black people in communities? On the collective bargaining piece, just to say this really quickly, we've got nearly 100,000 Black and Asian members that have identified. There's probably more than that, but nearly 100,000. And I'm now looking currently, where are our Black and Asian members? In which workplaces are they? So we can bring our reps together, our Black and Asian reps together to say, look, what is it that we need to drive through in these workplaces? We know that there is racist technology in algorithms. What are we doing about that? We know that the COVID health and safety pieces, that hits our Black and Asian members more. What are we doing about that? So there's a number of things where we want to bring together our Black and Asian members. It's never been done before. Basically, that we keep people in different sectors and all of that. But if we are really going to try and drive some of these answers through the collective bargaining agenda, then we have to bring our Black and Asian reps together. I already know by doing that, I can tell you the sectors where we have a number of Black and Asian reps in passenger, in transport, in civil air transport. But actually, we've got a lot of areas where we have lots of Black and Asian members and no Black and Asian reps. So how is any of this going to get on the bargaining table if we don't even have representatives from the Black and Asian community? So for me, part of what we need to do as trade unions, yes, there are the justice campaigns, but there is also getting our own house in order. Somebody mentioned on the comments about migrant workers getting blamed for low wages. That's absolutely right. That shouldn't be happening. There should be a rate for the job. Whoever does that job should get the rate for the job. So there's a huge amount that I want to bring to the table around ethnicity, the whole thing that's happening in terms of the ethnicity pay gap, what's happening in terms of institutional racism, all those things that we know is happening in employer after employer. But if we can't defeat it, because we're not getting our own house in order about driving good agreements through employers and saying we're not accepting that most of the low pay grades are with our Black and Asian workforce. That is not acceptable, and we have to make sure that we push that up. The other thing that I just wanted to mention briefly was the point I made about justice campaigns. And one of the things I said in our election campaign was that effectively we cannot now abdicate the responsibility. There is no politician coming over the horizon. They've been pretty much silent, not all, of course, but pretty much silent in terms of what's going on. And therefore, it's not good enough to us to write a check and say, well, look, we've done what we think we should do. We now have to be part of these campaigns in our communities for the long term. And there's a second part, which I won't go into because of time, where we want to resource by money and by people some of these justice campaigns in communities. And I hope to work with you on that as we come through the coming months. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Absolutely so right in the message you've given about uniting Black and Asian and mobilizing those workers, but also Black, Asian and white workers together in this fight against racism. And in terms of defending our rights as workers in every shape or form. So thank you very much for those powerful words. I'd like to introduce the next speaker, who's going to be Mick Whelan. So Mick is a General Secretary of ASLEF, Britain's trade union for train drivers. And with ASLEF, Mick has been a great ally of the anti-racist movement, fearlessly fighting against racism and sort of racism coming from the government, the far right, and also against racism in the workplace. So welcome, Mick.
Thank you. Great privilege to be here. I'm going to have to change my contribution because you've had so many good speakers that have tapped into many of the things I would like to say in the short period of time that we've had. I'd also like to pay my condolences to the MP that passed away, because what we do without violence. We do it for everybody, regardless of their political persuasion. And also, I would never like to compare my life experiences with many of those who experience racism, misogyny and homophobia on a daily basis. But it is about working class coming together, as Steve Hedley said earlier. But it's also about us coming together in our communities. You know, my parents came over here as immigrants. You know, in the days of no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. And I went to primary school under Grenfell. And I've got far more in common with the communities I grew up in and ordinary people who've been treated badly and don't get equality of opportunity, who don't get a meritocratic rise to education, social mobility, or a fair shake in their homes all their lives. Having said that then, recently I've been called names, and nothing like the names that people experience every day, because I'm a middle-aged white bloke. But somebody called me a woke wanker, and I apologise for language if it offends anybody. But I took the opportunity then just to check on a couple of the interpretations of woke. And alert to injustice, especially racism. Conscious of racial discrimination in society and other forms of oppression and injustice. In that case, I'm very proud to be called that name. And in the railway, we do like a badge or a T-shirt. I think I might get a few made. Having said that, the question's been asked by Jermain, what do we do? How do we, in a post-Trump and post-Brexit world, where all of a sudden it's right for these people to come out of the closet, to express their racism, to express their sexism, express their homophobia and other things, how do we challenge it? Well, first we have to challenge it nationally. And we have to challenge every lie that comes out of their mouths. We have to challenge every change of the narrative about what we want in our society. But also we have to challenge it internationally, because it's the people they choose as friends that frighten me. It's the whole world, since the rise of Golden Dawn in Greece, to Trump and what he did in America, to Orban in Hungary and elsewhere, that it's workers and racism everywhere we have to challenge. But before we can do that, we have to challenge it internally, within our own structures, in what we do. Quite proud of my trade union. Some time ago, we had a problem with the BNP, and they were going into trade unions, putting their hand up, declaring themselves racists. So we had to go to European Court of Human Rights for the right of free association, that only people that believe what we believe had to stand in our trade union and stand shoulder to shoulder with us. More recently, we run things like Mind the Gag campaign. And I've been to places where people I've known for years have come up to me and said, why are you gagging me? I said, well, what were you saying before that you can't say now? And if you can't say it now, you must have known it was wrong. Whether it was racist, whether it was banter, whatever you want to call it, whether it was misogynist or homophobic, if you're now not saying it because we've raised the profile of it, we're doing our job. And if you don't like the job that we do, maybe you shouldn't be part of our organisation and you should go somewhere else. Because unless we challenge it internally, we can't then challenge the other structures that we want to do. I want to also come back in what Sharon said. We've had a long-term policy that we just don't donate or affiliate. We get onto the boards of the organisations that we seek to join. If we're going to be that voice, we have to be part of that voice, and we have to articulate it everywhere that we go. And that's how you join communities together. That's how they change the world we live in, and that's how we drive things forward. But it will be the biggest challenge of all. We've had 11 years of austerity. They've hid behind that. Don't think in the post-COVID world that Rishi Sunak and his mates aren't going to start blaming other workers. Don't think they're going to start blaming immigrants, and don't think they're going to start taking the blame for their failures in our society and the society that they're trying to create. So it does frighten me going forward about what we do and how we do it. And I will come back to one or two other things that people have said. Right? Taking 2 million people off the voting register is a deliberate and undemocratic act and targeting society in the way in which they want to do. Taking away the right to protest. What are they afraid of? They're afraid of us? In that case, be afraid of us, because we're coming for them and we won't accept racism or injustice in our society. Before that, it was a lobbying transparency bill. It was about stopping their mates, giving them brown envelopes, right, for jobs, as we've seen in COVID, or contracts. But mostly it was about stopping civic society and trade unions having a voice and arguing against the things that they want to do. Trade union bill. That was about stopping people again, because trade unions aren't just about pay and conditions. They are about where we want to be as a society. They are about when they target our members through racist policies, through homophobic policies, misogynist policies, our right to challenge them, and their friends, their comrades, and their colleagues come out and stand with them. So I'll leave you very briefly now with a paraphrase of Frederick Douglass. I will stand with anybody to do right, but I will stand with nobody to do wrong. And I'm proud to be on here with so many people that want to do the right thing going forward. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mick, for that powerful contribution. I'd like to read out some more comments from our viewers. So I think it was Adnan. Adnan said in response to Sharon Graham's speech, brilliant, thank you. It's really important to get Black and Asian members involved in activism. And then Donna said the government and media go hand in hand, causing division and accelerating racism. Both need to be called out at every opportunity. And Moira said, thank you for remembering the Grenfell community who are still fighting for justice. Your voice is really important. So thank you to our viewers. Keep those comments coming in. I am now going to make another attempt at introducing our next speaker. So I'm going to give him a good intro again. So Peter Herbert is a fantastic human rights lawyer and chair of the Society of Black Lawyers, and he's been a fantastic activist against racism for many decades. Peter, I hope you can hear me, and I hope you're okay to give your speech now.
Yes. Hello. Good evening. Thank you. Sorry for the technical hitch, but welcome to everybody, brothers and sisters, comrades from Nairobi, Kenya. And I want to take the opportunity in the few minutes I've got just to reflect on some of the wider issues of having to confront a racist government in the United Kingdom. And that is essentially because it is very important to realize that whilst racism, of course, is sexism and any form of discrimination, not only unlawful, but has a debilitating effect on the victims in the United Kingdom, it is only a tiny, in a sense, small part of the mosaic which drives neo-colonialism and oppression, of which the British government and British capitalism continue to play a leading role. And just to give three very brief examples, but interlinked examples. Unilever is one of the largest corporations that operates in the world. It has benefited from 200,000 acres of stolen land in Kenya, where there are huge tea plantations on one side of the road and in grinding poverty on the other in Kericho and Bomet counties. The British government has recently had a ruling by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights that reparations should be paid to those 100,000 Kipsigis and Talha people who were removed from that land, and the company Unilever should either vacate that land and return it to its rightful owners, the Kenyan people, or it should pay proper lawful profits as a share of the dividends, huge dividends it gets. So one of the things that we'd like to call upon is the labour movement, until this is resolved, to boycott the products of Unilever and their tea, whether it be branded Lipton's or anybody else, until this is resolved. And you will know that Ribeiro-Addy MP and many others have demonstrated outside Unilever headquarters last June. They had racist images of native tea workers dressed in nothing. I mean, a great and deeper insult I cannot imagine, given the fact that this company neither pays profits on taxes in Kenya, nor does it pay taxes in the United Kingdom. And that is just one example. Two others, very briefly. During the Mau Mau insurgency, the British judicially killed 1,090 Kenyans and buried them in unmarked graves at Committee Maximum Security Prison. They have never, repeat, never returned those bodies to the families. It is an absolute international disgrace. We are meeting with some of the families to discuss with them what they might do. But we know that where, in a sense, the graves of British soldiers, sailors, airmen, you can be seen well tended around the world, in Kenya as well. And whilst the graves of Africans are left in the dirt. So this is a huge injustice which needs to be resolved, and it needs the help and support of the labour movement. And thirdly, the way in which the pandemic has played out can be seen in that there is a vaccine apartheid. And you will know that whilst delegates, home secretaries and others wring their hands, and health secretaries, if they hold their jobs for any period of time, wring their hands about the huge donations they're going to make to help Africa or anybody else. But in reality, is the fact the of countries which either cannot afford those stringent restrictions in Kenya and thrown hundreds of thousands out of work with no recourse to any public funds whatsoever. And whilst we're talking in a sense of corruption, right-wing fascism and racism, this is where it hits. It hits, in a sense, overseas, in developing countries with massive cuts of aid. And in a sense, Johnson's government is part of a historical process which has actually continued even under Labour governments, and it must be opposed. So if you want to fight racism in all its forms, it cannot just be the revolution at home. You have to join forces with the Kenyan plantation and tea workers, with their allies and compatriots in Sri Lanka and around the world, where the effects of this government are appallingly felt. And finally, climate change. Climate change is the largest and the single most dangerous thing the world faces. And yet, in a sense, we must not lose sight of that as we challenge and confront the racism, nepotism, and corruption of this government. So can I wish you well in the United Kingdom? And if anybody is coming to Kenya, please join us for a marvelous human rights conference on the 16th and 17th of December, where we'll be celebrating the Bandung Conference, and a whole week's activities between the 11th of December and the 19th. Thank you very much, and sorry I've gone slightly over my time.
Thank you, Peter, very much for your contributions, and obviously for that very international perspective in the fight against racism and in climate change, as you said. So we've had one more comment as well, just to read out from Dolores, to thank you, Sharon, for emphasizing the need for more Black reps, which is much needed. Our next speaker then I'd like to introduce is David Denny, who is the General Secretary of the Caribbean Movement for Peace and Integration and a member of the National Union of Public Workers in Barbados and leading reparations activist. So welcome, David. You need to be unmuted.
Thanks. I'm very happy to be here with you this afternoon. The Caribbean Movement for Peace and Integration fully support this conference, and we are a very close organization with Stand Up for Racism. The Caribbean Movement for Peace, we are very supportive of the work that Stand Up for Racism have been doing, especially in relation to the demonstrations and action that you have been organizing against Richard Drax, because our organization support the call for Richard Drax to pay the people of Barbados reparation for the damage that was done to many of our people who would have participated in the Drax Hall plantation as slaves and also as workers. I participated in the Black Lives Matter movement in Barbados, and that movement was able to hold a series of protest actions. That action created the conditions for us to remove a symbol in Barbados that represents slavery, which was the removal of the statue of Lord Nelson. It also created the conditions, the Black Lives Matter movement created conditions for Barbados to move towards becoming a republic. And on the 30th of November, the Queen of England will no longer be the head of state of Barbados, and a Barbadian will be given that opportunity to be the first head of state for Barbados. That will be a Barbadian national after our independence from 1966. So that a lot of things came out of those struggles after the death of George Floyd, not only in the United States of America or Europe, but right here in Barbados. So that our organization, enjoy working with a group of labor leaders in the UK and a group of social activists in the UK that are fighting for change, and that are fighting not only for change in the UK, but are also extending that solidarity to our region. I think that is very, very important, because our region are involved in a lot of fights against racism and against capitalism and against all forms of exploitation of our people and our resources, to the extent that we have to extend our solidarity with countries like Cuba. Cuba have done so much for this world in terms of helping us deal with some of the most dreadful diseases. In Barbados, we have over 100 medical workers from Cuba that are helping us to deal with the COVID-19 situation, which is a very serious problem in Barbados. So that I want to use this opportunity, in terms of winding up in my statement, to say that all labor leaders all over the world should offer their solidarity to the people of the Republic of Cuba, because Cuba is extending an international solidarity medical movement that is saving many lives and many poor working class people lives throughout the world. So I want to say to you that our number one struggle in our region is to demand the removal of the political and economic blockade against Cuba, so Cuba can extend a lot more international solidarity work. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David, for that contribution. We've had so many interesting contributions here today. So I just want to remind everyone that Stand Up to Racism is an anti-racist organisation that is just formed to campaign against all forms of racism. And on our platform, there'll be a range of different views expressed, sometimes on other issues. But, throughout this conference, we've had a range of Labour movement activists, members of the Labour Party, elected representatives of the Labour Party, but also it's been a cross-party event with people from the Lib Dems, SNP, Plaid Cymru, and so on. So we are a cross-party organisation. People have a range of different views, but we're formed to unite against racism. So I'd also want to let everyone know that we've got over 1,000 people watching live at the moment, and we've still got many more people tuning in as the event is going on. So do keep tuning in, and if you're watching on Facebook or whatever, do keep sharing the event so other people know that you're watching. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. So the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union has been such an amazing ally in the fight against racism. They're always out on the demonstrations, giving us support, coming to all of our events. So I just want to say thank you for everything that you do. And I'd like to welcome the General Secretary of BFAWU, Sarah Woolley.
Thanks, Savi. I wasn't ready for that. I was just sharing. The stream on Facebook when you put me on to pin. But thank you for the invitation to speak today. I wasn't really sure what to focus on as there's been such a fantastically varied platform with some really inspiring and thought-provoking contributions already. I know the theme is how we defeat Johnson's racist offensive, but I actually think the problem goes much deeper than just the government, though we know that they encourage racism by their actions and the laws that they pass and the words that they speak on a daily basis. What I've seen travelling around workplaces and representing members and negotiating wages over the last few years is that for so many people, racism is a daily experience because it is so ingrained in our society and our institutions, and it's down to us to change that together. Something that I'm passionate about is that we need to be better at trade unions, or as trade unions, in supporting our members in workplaces who are facing this, better at empowering our representatives to challenge racism in the workplace, providing training and resources for members, reps and activists so that they can make sure that workplace policies aren't discriminatory and that derogatory language is not welcome, and to make sure that they can debunk, if you like, some of the right-wing rhetoric that's used by replying with facts and balanced opinion rather than just getting into an argument, because we know that that doesn't really ever get people to change their minds or thought processes. This will also then support them in the communities, and we need to work with community organisations too. We need to make sure that we're creating the space for our members to grow and challenge us as organisations and have the confidence to do that, but also have a voice in their branches and the union as a whole. Because we know that the right wing are extremely good at painting themselves as one of us. It's no coincidence Johnson acts like this blundering idiot and Farage paints himself as a guy that likes a pint in his local. But they're just the tip of the iceberg, because it's people like Stephen Yaxley Lennon that change their name to be more like one of the lads from the estate so that he can pretend that he talks like us, so people will listen when he's spouting out his vile racist lies, that he eases people into. So even those that aren't inherently racist start to think and speak and act as they are. And he and those like him are the ones that we need to prepare our reps against in the workplace and support our BAME members when they are faced with the rhetoric. So when Yaxley or his crew have convinced people that all lives matter, our reps have the confidence and the power to reply that all lives cannot possibly matter until Black Lives Matter. We also need to look inward at ourselves as trade unions and make sure that we're celebrating our diversity, that we haven't got barriers in place that prevent our Black, Asian and ethnic minority members from being active or progressing through into paid union roles, whether that be locally, regionally or nationally. And we need to make sure that we've got a safe space where acts of racism can be reported to us, and that we've built up the trust that if it is a member, dealt with through the appropriate channels, because we need our own house in order. And I know it's been mentioned a few times, but we really do, before we can call out the employers our members work for or the government for their openly divisive, discriminatory, racist policies. We held a really powerful BAME network meeting at our annual conference, and we're going to build on the conversations that we had there, but our members told us about the racism they face on a daily basis, the challenges around finding help and support when they need it, and the disappointment and the hurt that they feel when it's their colleagues that they spend day in, day out, and that are the ones that are making them feel as they did. And there didn't seem to be a fair process in the workplaces that our members were talking to us from to deal with it, as it was often brushed under the carpet, or if a formal grievance process was followed, the situation just got worse, and this isn't good enough. So we'll work with the network and highlight those employers that think it's okay to brush racism under the carpet. We'll listen to our members, learn from their knowledge and experience, and act on their ideas and suggestions, whilst empowering them and supporting them and standing in absolute solidarity with them. We will challenge those that use racist language and hold them to the letter of our rule book. We also want to learn from others too, so that we're not missing anything that may not be covered by the experiences our members talk to us about, as we recognise we're quite a small union in comparison to some others, and not everyone will come forward. It takes time to build trust and confidence in a new network and its purpose and capabilities. And that's why Stand Up to Racism is so important, and this week's conference, especially because we need to learn from each other and, more importantly, work together to stamp out racism, not only in our movement in the UK, but society as a whole worldwide. And that means leaving this weekend and putting into action what has been spoken about, using the resources that are available and supporting each other. Thanks, Sabi.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for those really useful words you've given us in the contribution in terms of obviously arming the reps and activists and building confidence in all our sort of fight against racism in our workplaces and trade unions. So the next speaker I have a pleasure to introduce is Tala Ahmed. Hello, Tala. He's a co-chair of Stand Up to Racism, today representing Muslim Council of Britain. He is a long-standing anti-racist campaigner and has played a crucial role in building unity against Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and the far right. Okay.
Thank you. That's a very generous introduction. I hope I do justice to that. But can I just begin by saying, what a privilege to share a platform with so many leading lights in the campaign against racism and all forms of prejudice and hatred. Keeping a view on the time, and given what so many inspirational contributions already, I shall try and focus on some of the few issues that I think just need sort of hammering in again. The first point I want to say is that I express my sympathy and condolences to Sir David Amess and the despicable murder of his. But I also sadly observe that while this should have been a moment for us to reflect why each one of us must be much more careful, much more proactive in fighting and challenging prejudice, racism, and hatred, our government seems to be learning the opposite message. Only today, the message is that they're looking at whether the prevent has been effective and whether it needs recalibrating. And the point there isn't really to let go of prevent, but to see how it can become more draconian and more counterproductive. And almost all of you will know that prevent is a policy that create grievances that legitimizes targeting of faith communities, especially Muslims, and it belittles people of color mostly. So our government seems to be hell-bent on learning the wrong lessons and festering or pandering to the right-wing, hateful, populist politics and culture. And that's really worrying. And in that spirit, I share the concerns that many of my fellow speakers has expressed. So I'm going to focus on really 5 things. So at its extreme, it's language of hate that we need to challenge. And I don't think it needs explaining what language of hate is. But then language of hate doesn't come straight away. Before that, it comes a language of division. We divide people into classes in terms of faith, in terms of color, in terms of other criteria. And the intention being is to create a hierarchy that some are more worthy than others. But that comes on the back of language of inequality. When we distinguish between people to justify ideas and marginalization of communities, because some part of the community is deemed to be more worthy of a better treatment, whether in the name of progress or whether in the name of compatibility with British values or in terms of patriotism. But that then also stand on the politics of pragmatism, and I deliberately chose that word. In the name of politics of pragmatism, winning vote, often too many of our politicians are unwilling to challenge and stand up to ideas and views which marginalize people, which creates others within society, which belittles people of Islamic faith, people of color, people of certain gender, people of certain class and geography. And so when we fight against racism, when we fight against Islamophobia, when we fight against anti-Semitism, homophobia, what we need to understand and recognize is that it is a fight that can only be won if we accept and subscribe to the idea that singling out one community is an attack on all of us, not just on that community. Hatred against one particular community is hatred against all of us, and we must all collectively fight it and challenge it. We also need to bear in mind is that we have to challenge the idea that somehow Western Europe has monopoly over civility and equality and justice and fairness. Because the truth is, it doesn't. It doesn't. And often many of the problem arises from this sense of superiority that somehow in the Western Europe, we have mastered the art of equality and justice and so on. As so many speakers has highlighted, this is clearly not the case. The other thing we need to remember is that, and this current government seems to be very willing to advance that, is that calling out racism, calling out bigotry, calling out prejudice is not outrageous, is not offensive. So when Don Butler calls out in Parliament the lies of our Prime Minister, that does not fall below the standard of decency. But when our Prime Minister demands and gets away with his repeated and protracted attack on minorities, attack on faith communities and so on, it is that language and attitude which is indecent and we must not tolerate. So I will conclude by just observing this, that many of the attacks starts on the basis of something that appears reasonable and nuanced and in the interest of our country. For example, when the rules are tightened on immigration or the talk of correcting the human rights narrative, these are effectively in the end is going to lead to a slippery slope in which we target minorities, we target trade unionists, we target Muslims and so many others. And we must be very vigilant and careful and stand up against these kind of regressive and prejudicial journey towards creating a more divisive country. Thank you once again, and I commend Stand Up to Racism and all my comrades on this platform and everybody who's listening from wherever they are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tala, for that really important contribution. So just to remind everyone, Tala made some brilliant points on the need to campaign against Islamophobia. Next month is Islamophobia Awareness Month. That's in November. So I just want to read out some more comments from our viewers. So Dolores said, thank you, Sharon Graham, for emphasising the need for more Black reps, much needed. And Ramal said, institutional racism is a big one. We need to tackle this wherever we encounter it. Also, I mentioned that there are over 1,000 people viewing us live at the moment. But just to say that yesterday we had around 2,000 people joining us, and it's likely that we've got around that or more. Because sometimes it's difficult to collate the numbers, the total numbers that you have with a live event, because we're actually streaming the event on so many different platforms that we only know the numbers afterwards, all very technical, and it's not my forte, I must confess, but I just thought I'd let you know that. So there's likely to be around 2,000 people joining us, and that's fab. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our next speaker. So our next speaker is a Labour councillor and a leading campaigner against racism in the workplace and also across society more generally. And here today representing Unison is Margaret Greer. So I'd like to welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabi. And hello, everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me to say a few words at this international conference. In Black History Month, which I proudly celebrate 365 days of the year. Solidarity greetings from Unison and National Black Members Committee, and also just want to give a shout out to Justice for Drenfield and echo my sentiments for what's happened with Sir David Amos as well. Friends, Elie Wiesel once said, "There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest." And so, having seen events across the globe domestically over the past 18 months, with the murder of George Floyd and the legacy of Trump mania, government ministers normalizing white supremacy, which triggered an avalanche of abuse and booing targeted at Premier League football matches for players taking the knee, trolling and threatening racial abuse on social media of England Black players for missing a penalty, the so-called football fan as racist in the beautiful game is systemic of wider society in the case. But I believe that Black history is often marginalized. So it is a pivotal time to acknowledge the achievements and provide an opportunity. But we know that things have to change, colleagues, and we need to do better to understand the lived experience of Black people, not just in October, but every second, minute, hour, month of every year across the UK. With this government's legislation to bring regulations such as the new police sentencing and courts bill that also gives increased powers for stop and search, which we know have had a disproportionate impact against young Black people. We must continue to oppose these policing powers of surveillance and banning lawful protests. You see, friends, the only wrong thing to do is to do nothing, because the issue of systemic racism needs to be met with solutions, including widespread education, addressing the legacies of racism and racial inequality of opportunity that Black people still face, with community mobilization with direction and purpose. We must require employers to devise and implement plans to eradicate the gender pay gap and pay inequalities underpinned by race or disability. Extend the pay gap reporting and tackling pay discrimination based on race. Public sector employers and those providing public services have a legal obligation under the Public Sector Equality Duty and Equality Act 2010 to eliminate discrimination and set equality objectives to achieve this. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, they need to put race back on the agenda and hold people accountable, especially employers. Because Black people have a voice, but when it comes to decision making and those decisions don't reflect the needs of Black people, then it's time for Black people to stand up and take their rightful place on the world stage by tackling these injustices. We are creating a legacy for the next generation. It's worth noting that both Muslims harassment, a great deal of hate monitoring has emphasized the way visibly Muslim women have come in for physical assault in public spaces. Black women, particularly those in prominent positions in the public arena, have experienced a heightened level of trolling and violent threats. Both Muslim women and Black women can come in for some kind of racist sexism that cannot just be separated out, but forms a distinct and destructive experience. And so it's time we all come together and stand up against all forms of racism and Islamophobia and defend the rights of all of our people. You see, as a trade unionist and counsellor and community activist, my life's work is to improve the working lives and defend the rights of all our people and communities. And so I'll say this with you today. And so I come here today with the determination that we must continue to speak out and strive for a better future, because challenges are what makes life interesting, but overcoming them is what makes life meaningful. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for listening. I'll hand you back over to Sabi.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, who needs very little introduction. He is the co-convenor of Stand Up to Racism along with myself. I'd like to welcome Raymond Bennett.
I want to start off by thanking everybody for speaking today on this conference of showing unity and strength against racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. And I'd like to start off by saying it's the anniversary. What I'd like to start off by saying is they repeat the words of Frederick Douglass, Black History Month. They divide each to conquer both. They use racism and division to break us. And that's why it's so important to have a widespread organisation, as what people have said today, that challenges everything. And Boris de Piffle Johnson speaks for his group. He went to a school that's called Public, which nobody else goes to. And he still presides over the highest death rate in Europe and the highest hospitalizations in Europe after COVID. In other words, they present themselves as not taking responsibility for things. And I think that's rooted in a kind of very clear view about why they don't care about us. I also want to talk about the anniversary, the 16th of October, 1993. We marched on the headquarters of the BNP. We marched with Doreen Lawrence, because that was the year before when Stephen Lawrence was murdered. And what we said was that it was important to march on that. Unfortunately, 10,000 of us, that march was broken up by the police. And I think that, to be honest, what we have to say is that we were right to march then. And we marched with a Holocaust survivor, a man called Leon Greenman. And he said something which was very important. He said that he came to this country as a refugee. He came to this country escaping what happened in the Holocaust. And we say never again. And that's the reason why we have to oppose the so-called nationalities bill. Because it's not a bill about any form of equality. It's a bill that institutionalizes checking people genetically and biologically to see what age they are, where they're from. Something which, to be honest, we haven't seen since the last of the Second World War in the treatment of refugees and people escaping and looking for some place of safety. And when you think about COP taking place on November the 6th, and you think about the fact that the Syrian refugees came here as a consequence of drought, we have to say that we're going to have much more refugees. And instead of putting policemen on motorbikes, we have to make sure that people don't die as they did in the dunes of Calais, and that they're welcome here. The refugees are told that they're welcome here. After all, when you look at Cheddar Man, he had black skin and blue eyes, apparently, as the original British guy. When people talk about what are you proud of, I'm proud of resistance. I'm proud of the NHS that saved so many lives, that my mother came here as a migrant to be a nurse in, and now we're told that migrants produce low wages. No, they don't. The reason why we've had a 25% increase in bosses' wages hasn't been the sudden arrival of migrants. Oh, the more migrants come, the more the bosses' wages go up. It's the opposite. The more migrants have come, they've produced wealth and health for all of us. And the people that have actually benefited from that have been the people at the top of our society, the 1%. And that's the reason why I think it's important that we have to remember in these months as we stand out in resistance, when we start to organise. It matters that the TUC have sponsored this conference. It matters that we make a stand on UN Anti-Racism Day on the 21st. We have an international stand, because there are too many Orbans who encourage anti-Semitism, attack George Soros. There are too many Bolsonaros. There are too many people like Trump. That's why we have to say that on UN Anti-Racism Day, that celebrates the attack on apartheid, the attack on Sharpeville, we're going to come out and demonstrate. We're going to come out and do a day of action in our workplaces, in our schools. I'm glad that educators are speaking out and saying that we want to rescue our real history. When we talk about people like William Coughlin and John Wedderburn, part of the Chartist movement in this country, part of the movement for suffragettes, these movements were integrated, were multiracial, were multi-faith. And I think we have to understand the struggle that we are fighting for today is about how you make history, about what difference you make today, about fighting for that. Jermain asked a question about what makes a difference. I think the most important difference is to also stand up for whenever you see injustice, is to train generations of people to realise how they've actually got, how they've got change. I'm sure that the bosses that watch people burn in Grenfell feel that they're going to get away with it. But one of the most important things to do is to never let go, is to support the Grenfell campaigns that take place. And I think as we go through the next couple of months, I really want to focus on the ability to understand that we are the majority. It's us versus the racists. It's us versus those people that try and use division. And part of the problem with Boris Johnson, we should be clear, he talks about levelling up. He hasn't got a plan. That's the reason why he keeps pushing racism, misdirection. And we have to keep putting the spotlight back on him. I'm glad that the people from the Caribbean have spoken up, about Drake's campaign, because the people that organised slavery, the people like Drake's family with a million brick, multi-million-pound house, which still's got a plantation inside Barbados, they owe us. They owe us. They owe the majority of us for what they've robbed us. And then it's not true that there isn't money. I mean, to be honest, I'm unfortunately old enough to remember the questions that took place after 9/11 or during the war on Iraq. Actually, I think these things, the Islamophobia that came out after that, actually encouraged the divisions. I remember Butler Schloss saying that if you fight wars in other places, that some of those bombs are going to explode in our own country. And I think that's one of the things we have to learn. The lessons of history is that we have to stand up against anybody who tries to divide us and use tyranny to break us. Because at the end of the day, the reason why we've been able to break the BNP was because they were Nazis, but because we mobilized against them. The reason why we made Tommy Robinson into the dustbin of history is because when he marched, we stopped him. When he put out a leaflet, we blocked it and exposed it. When the football lads said they were going to make the terraces theirs, we took over our terraces, we took over our streets. And that's the reason why we always have to remember, when I say black and white unite and fight, that's where our strength lies. It lies not in waiting for people like Boris Johnson to say, do you recognise Black Lives Matter? It matters in the way that we take to our streets, demand and support our people that support us. That's why we have to support the MPs that support us and don't support the people that don't support us. That's what matters. We have a movement that can make sure our voices are heard. And I'm going to stop there and say, please join us on the demonstration on the 20th and the 23rd and on the demonstration that takes place on the 19th.
Thanks very much, Weyman. Very powerful. So the next speaker, who's going to be the final speaker for this rally tonight, is Gary Younge. So I've got a great pleasure to introduce you, Gary. As you'll all know, Gary is a writer, broadcaster, and professor of sociology at the University of Manchester, as well as a leading progressive activist. He's written extensively about racist populism, the effects of racism, and how to mobilize against it. So take it away, Gary.
Thank you, Sabi. And if I'm the last speaker, then thank you for all the contributions from all over the world that really kind of illustrate the degree to which this is a global struggle, that while our enemies can talk about nationalism and the government can spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on new flags, that it's the flag of anti-racism that we will wave, and that flag has a meaning everywhere in the world. And I feel like in Britain, in this moment, we are in Dickensian times, because they are the best of times and the worst of times when it comes to racism. On the one hand, you have a government that I've never seen a government quite as brazen as this one when it comes to racism, quite as open. And as has been mentioned, the rise in attacks, the rise in Islamophobia, a series of a litany, really, of statistics that show that things are really, really bad. But on the other hand, in my lifetime, anyway, I've never seen, or in my conscious lifetime, I've never seen the potential for so much anti-racism as we are seeing now. That if we go back to last June, where there were those two competing viruses, the viral video of George Floyd being killed, that spread like a bushfire around the world and mobilized hundreds of thousands of people all around the world, and the virus of COVID, which disproportionately killed Black and Asian people and affected Black and Asian people in this country and poor people around the world, then we saw two things. That first of all, we saw the effect of systemic racism, the stuff that you can't catch on a video, the fact that we're more likely to be unemployed, underemployed, poorly housed, stuck in terrible working conditions. If at the bottom of every pile that you can find, we are more likely to have Black people, more likely to have Asian people at the bottom of that pile. And that includes our medical outcomes. And so we see that racism is a matter of life and death, which doesn't just show up as a policeman with his knee on your neck. It's not always as blatant as that. But we also saw that latent community rise up not just here, but all over the world, and take to the streets and say, we've had enough. And that community was in Britain, a multiracial community, led by the young, that was speaking an entirely different language, and real fantastic interventions by people like Marcus Rashford, who kind of cut through the nonsense that this government was trying to do in pitching working class white people against black people in anti-racism. When Marcus Rashford says he's the one who's trying to get the children fed, white children and black children, that there is no contradiction. And sometimes the left does fall down on this, trying to make out that there is some complicated contradiction between race and class. There isn't. That you can't understand racism unless you understand class, and you can't understand class politics unless you understand race. To try and understand them separately is to misunderstand both totally. And that comes to what I've loved about this plenary, and what I love about the work of Stand Up to Racism, is that it's about, if we're talking about how do you defeat Boris Johnson, then you have to form a coalition. The black people can't do it on their own. Asian people can't do it on their own. Muslims can't do it on their own. Trade unionists can't do it on their own, but we can do it together. And actually the potential for anti-racism in this country is far more potent, I seriously believe, than the potential for racism. That's why the Sewell report was such a dud. They released this report, which full of errors and ridiculous claims about institutional racism, but the country had moved on. And that's not to be in denial. We saw what happened at the end of the Euros. But actually that story ends with a massive fight back of ordinary people, black and white people, who force a shame on the government and a shame on the political leaders for the racism that they have galvanized and provoked. And so I really do think that our potential as anti-racists, that's what gives me hope. That's what gives me optimism. The racism is terrible. It's always been there. In some ways, I feel it's worse than it's ever been. In other ways, maybe not so much. But the anti-racism, not just the passive kind of like, yes, it's terrible what they do, but the number of people who are prepared to take to the streets, to put their name to things, to stand up, is growing. And we have to, first of all, take courage and succor from that. And secondly, we have to be there when they show up. That we can't just have this conglomeration of people arise for a march and then go home as though the march will end racism. It won't. But the people who are in it, who then go back to their workplaces and their communities, they will, and they can. This is the third reference to Frederick Douglass in this plenary, and it's one that I want to end with. Actually, just before I do, just a short reflection. I live in Hackney in London, just by Ridley Road Market. And Ridley Road Market today is this cacophony of working class white people selling plantains to Ghanaian born and or black people of Caribbean heritage, the Kashmiri kebab shop, just some of Britain and London at its finest, a kind of ease of presence and a kind of not a clash of cultures, but a meeting of cultures. That was a place that the Nazis used to organize on. There is a drama at the moment on BBC called Ridley Road, which centers on the Nazis marching down Ridley Road. There is no way the Nazis would come close to Ridley Road at this moment, because we won that space. We won that space, and that is not a question of time or tide. It's not about people getting over it. They were fought. They were fought and they lost. And wherever they emerge, they can be fought and they were lost. And they can lose. And I want to end, as Weyman did, and Mick Whelan mentioned Frederick Douglass with a different quote. Because there's no guarantee that when we fight, that we will win. But there is an absolute guarantee that if we don't fight, we can't win. And the Frederick Douglass quote that I love and want to end on is that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And so we have to keep on making those demands for anti-racism where we live, where we work, in Parliament, in our trade unions, wherever we have the opportunity. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Gary, for that brilliant speech. As always, it's a fantastic contribution. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to all of our speakers and everyone for tuning in. Before I wrap up, I want to read out a statement from our president, Diane Abbott MP, who unfortunately had to give her apology. She wasn't able to join us live, but she did very kindly send us a statement to read out. So I'm just going to read that out now. Thank you all for coming today and this weekend, and thank you to all the great speakers and to the organisers for making it happen. I'm sorry that I'm unable to be with you live. It is really an achievement to have such an international lineup of speakers, to have people representing so many campaigns, representing so many ethnic minorities, and drawing on such a wide array of labour movement speakers. It was great to hear from you all. I had an article in Saturday's Morning Star where I wrote about the racist offensive by this government and how it is almost dizzying in scope and pace. I don't want to rehash that entire article here, but just focus on one key point. In the last few days, there have been a series of reports. One from the Home Office said that hate crime of all types had risen by 9% since the pandemic began, but that racist hate crime had risen by 12%. Another report from Liberty showed that police forces across England and Wales solved fewer cases of hate crime in 2020 than they did 5 years ago, while reports of hate crime had more than doubled in the same period. And the press reported that Priti Patel was seeking immunity from prosecution for any border force staff who caused someone to die while crossing the channel. All of that in the space of a few days. What this tells us is that there is a widespread racism in society and that this is not being tackled by this government at all. On the contrary, this government is promoting racism through denial it even exists, through opposing taking the knee, through whipping up racism around deportation flights and around refugees. And there is much worse to come in the form of the new Nationality and Borders Bill. We already see that the government has not kept its reactionary Brexit promise to reduce migration, because now it is bringing overseas workers to be HGV drivers or butchers or seasonal workers. You name it, they are recruiting for it. Because there has been a huge overflow of workers following Brexit, which has made us all worse off. And the irony is that far more of those workers who've fled or just dropped out are British born, not born in the EU. It turns out that the only people who dislike Brexit more than EU workers is British workers, but we are all worse off as a result. Now these newly recruited workers will still be living here, working here at least temporarily, but what they won't be doing is exercising any rights as workers. They won't be joining a union and they won't be exercising their rights as citizens. This is the model for how this government wants us all. This is what Brexit was always aiming for. And this isn't hindsight. Some of us said it at the time. So how do we respond to these huge number of attacks? Well, first I would say, tell your colleagues in your workplace, campaign organisation and trade union branches, do not believe a word this government says. If they say they are aiming for a high wage economy, it means the opposite. If they say Brexit will make you better off, they are lying. Then we have to understand that the situation is going to get worse. As the economic situation worsens and living standards decline, scapegoating and racism will be increased as night follows day. Then we have to answer every single one of these attacks. They cannot be allowed to divide us, whether it is stop and search or prevent, or the rise in hate crimes against every ethnic minority, or deportations, or allowing people to die in hugely disproportionate numbers in the pandemic. Every single justice must be fought, and every act of discrimination must be called out, and every ethnic minority defended. Unity is our strength, and we cannot let them divide us. Thank you. So thank you, Diane Abbott, if you're tuning in, for that very wonderful statement. So again, thank you all for tuning in and joining us. Thank you to all of our speakers for your brilliant contributions, both in today's 5 p.m. session, but also throughout the whole conference over yesterday and today. We've had some fantastic contributions. A very, very big thank you to all of you for all of your support and for taking the time and effort to join us. So before we go, I would like to make a few announcements. So there's quite a few, so get your pens and papers ready, please. So the first takeaway I want to send you off with, a big important date for your diaries, is Saturday, the 19th of March, 2022, is going to be the International UN Anti-Racism Day of Action. So as you know, you're familiar with this, there's many events taking place across the globe and many different events taking place. There's also a really big build up to it as well. So it's very exciting. So put that date in your diary, 19th of March, 2022. And also all of our campaigning work, this conference, UN Anti-Racism Day, and everything we do is only possible because of your support. So do please consider donating by clicking the Join or Donate tab on our website. So I cannot stress how important your financial contribution is to us. We wouldn't be able to do the work that we do if it wasn't for ordinary people giving a small amount each. It all adds up and it's all very important. So however big or small, please do give us a financial contribution. So the next announcements I'm going to make in chronological order. So on the 19th of October, that's this Tuesday, it's the Time for Justice event, which is marking the anniversary of Ricky Reel's murder. It's on the 19th of October. There's an event, right? So check that out, and do check out our social media because we'll be posting stuff about this tomorrow. And then on Wednesday, the 20th of October, it's the National Day of Action to oppose the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is opposing the hostile environment. That's on Wednesday. Then on Friday, we are supporting Show Racism the Red Card's annual Wear Red Day. So that's this Friday, the 22nd of October. And then the day after, Saturday, the 23rd of October, at 12 noon, there is the Defend the Right to Asylum protest called by Amnesty UK, which Stand Up to Racism is also supporting. Do keep an eye out on our social media. If you're joining the webinar on Zoom for this event, it's posted in the chat. But it's all for people joining on other platforms. It's you'll see on our Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as well. So keep an eye out for that. And then November is Islamophobia Awareness Month, so there'll be events around the country. Stand Up to Racism groups do lots of events in November marking Islamophobia Awareness Month. Also check out the Muslim Council of Britain's website and social media, and Muslim Engagement and Development, their social media and website. They do great stuff during November. Also in November is the COP Summit. So on the 6th of November, there will be the anti-racist block at the Glasgow demonstration. And then on the 7th of November, there'll be a national online meeting, which is part of an official event at the COP26 People's Summit. So keep an eye out for details on that. And then in January, we will be organising an event marking Holocaust Memorial Day and to stress the importance of uniting against anti-Semitism and fascism, and saying loudly and clearly, never again. And then finally, I want to encourage you all to join your local Stand Up to Racism group, and you can find out details of how to do that on our website. And then before I go, I just want to say we've had around 2,000 or so people joining us, and it's been fantastic. So it's been a brilliant weekend. Thank you all for all of your contributions, and I hope you have a good evening. Thank you.